at a time when negotiations were ongoing, is a strategic failure that has had a devastating impact on civilians. Bombs and missiles are not the path towards sustainable peace. They bring death, destruction, and misery, in many cases only deepening grievances and fueling future violence. In Iran, as the conflict has progressed, US and Israeli attacks have increasingly struck densely populated residential areas and destroyed civilian infrastructure. Homes, medical facilities, schools, courts, transport networks, and energy installations have been hit across all 31 provinces of the country. According to the Iranian authorities, more than 1,900 civilians have been killed and tens of thousands injured. The targeting of nuclear facilities is reckless beyond comprehension. These attacks raise serious concerns over compliance with international humanitarian and human rights law, under which the protection of civilians must remain central. Mr. President, the people of Iran are caught between conflict and repression. I'm gravely concerned by reports that since the start of the hostilities, the Iranian authorities have intensified their crackdown on civic space. Law enforcement authorities have repeatedly said that dissent will be treated as collaboration with the enemy and punished harshly for acts including filming damaged sites or communicating about the conflict. The authorities have intensified arrests, judicial cases, and bans against people and media outlets accused of promoting so-called enemy narratives. We have reason to believe hundreds of people have been arrested, while journalists, activists, and public figures have been placed under surveillance. The internet has been shut down for nearly a month. War does not reduce the responsibility of the Iranian authorities to abide by their human rights obligations. Mr. President, the military escalation in the Middle East and the Gulf is reaching dangerous levels. It must end. There is a high and rising risk of further contagion and increased civilian suffering in the countries directly involved. Beyond the region, there are fears of grave economic consequences, from deepening poverty and hunger to shortages of medicine and fuel. It is imperative that all parties halt the escalation. I call on the United States and Israel to end their attacks against Iran, and I call on Iran to stop attacking its neighbors and to respect and protect the human rights of its own people. I urge restraint on all sides and implore the parties to conflict to return to negotiations, the only path towards a durable solution to their differences. Divisions within this Council must not distract us from a shared focus on the human rights of people across the Gulf and the Middle East. As I address you for a second time in 3 days, I urge to prioritize preventing further suffering, protecting all civilians regardless of nationality or location, and seeking long-term sustainable peace. Thank you.
I thank the High Commissioner. And I now give the floor to Ms. Farida Shahid, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, who will deliver a statement on behalf of the Coordination Committee of Special Procedures by video. She has the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, and distinguished delegates, today I address you in my capacity as the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education and on behalf of the Special Procedures Coordination Committee. The Special Procedures have been closely monitoring the rapid escalation of hostilities during the military offensive of the United States of America and Israel against Iran. In our statement earlier this month, we strongly condemned the strike on the elementary school in Minab. On 28 February, U.S. Tomahawk missiles struck the elementary school around 10:45 a.m. local time as classes were underway. At least 175 people were killed, mostly children aged 7 to 12. Large parts of the schools were reduced to rubble, families torn apart and devastated. I reiterate what we said in our statement. A strike on a school is a grave assault on children, on education, and the future of an entire community. International humanitarian law is crystal clear. Attacks directed against civilians or civilian objects, or which fail to adequately distinguish between military objectives and civilian infrastructure, constitute serious violations of international humanitarian law and may amount to war crimes. This is not an isolated incident. According to various reports, over 600 schools and educational facilities have already been destroyed or severely damaged, and over 230 children and teachers killed. The strike on the school is just one consequence of this war. Over 1,000 civilians have been killed, 3 million people displaced, hospitals and World Heritage sites destroyed in Iran, while striking oil infrastructure risks serious long-term health effects in the world. As parents, we watch them grow with tears and fears and sleepless nights and sheer joy when they learn and laugh, discover and grow. There's no bigger pain for any parent than to lose a child, an unimaginable rupture of life. Excellencies, on behalf of all the world's parents, I ask, who exactly will be held responsible for these deaths? Surely we cannot allow the lives of these and other children to be extinguished without consequences. Mr. President, schools are civilian objects and children are expressly protected under international humanitarian law and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Directing attacks against civilian objects unless they become military objects is prohibited under treaty and customary international humanitarian law. Indiscriminate attacks are strictly prohibited. Intentional attacks on educational buildings that are not military objectives are war crimes listed in the Rome Statute under Article 8. But what does this really mean in terms of liability? Ultimately, the responsibility lies with the state that carried out the attack on the school to conduct thorough, prompt, and impartial investigations into this attack and all attacks on civilian objects. Preliminary investigation by the U.S. military has concluded that American forces were responsible for the missile strike. The school and other buildings in the compound were each struck individually by precision munition, meaning that U.S. military clearly intended to strike the school. Ongoing investigation suggests that the school attack might have been a result of a mistaken targeting by the U.S. military using outdated intelligence. If officially confirmed, this would mean that the principle of taking feasible precautions in attacks was most likely violated. In particular, the rule that a party to the conflict must do everything feasible to verify that targets pursued are in fact military objectives. If journalists and civil society groups using only open source access could relatively quickly establish that the school was separated from the wider compound and visibly marked, the U.S. military, with all the tools at its disposal, surely could have done so prior to the attack. They had an obligation to do so. The question is why outdated information was used. Who failed to verify the data? Who exactly in the chain of command was responsible for verification, and what liability under domestic and international law will the person or persons face in the end? The families of the victims deserve a transparent and authoritative account of what happened, as well as justice and accountability. Mr. President, we mandate holders appointed by the Human Rights Council stress the importance of accountability. All violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law must be investigated and those responsible held to account. We welcome the independent international fact-finding mission on the Islamic Republic of Iran regarding ongoing violations, including the attack on the Minab school. It's vital that the fact-finding mission carry out its mandate fully without obstruction. We also welcome the Secretary General's annual report on children and armed conflict as a form of accountability, since its annex lists parties to conflict which have attacked schools, which are considered one of 6 grave violations against children. State responsibility in the form of reparation, restitution, and rehabilitation for internationally wrongful acts is another important channel. This may include rebuilding schools, trauma-informed education, and supporting the reintegration of affected children into education. My 2025 report on the right to education in armed conflict argues that education itself can be a form of reparation for children who survive the horrors of war. Excellencies, this tragic incident must not fall into an accountability gap. Every possible avenue for accountability must be explored, and if the existing framework falls short of holding the responsible party to account, the priority must be creating a stronger framework. This is a matter of justice. Parents and children around the world need assurance that such violations will not be repeated. There must be no impunity for countries and decision makers who permit attacks on children. In concluding, I stress that the right to education remains fully applicable during armed conflict, protected under both international human rights law and international humanitarian law, which have mutually reinforcing and complementary roles. The right to education is a life-saving right. In crisis, education gives children a supportive environment, a sense of normalcy, psychosocial support, and pathways to recovery. Protecting education is both a legal obligation and investment in peace. Therefore, education must be treated as a core humanitarian priority alongside food, water, shelter, and healthcare. While this urgent debate focuses on the school attack in Minab, the human cost of this conflict extends across the region. The protection of all civilians on all sides of this conflict must remain the central priority. All efforts must be directed towards preventing further harm, ensuring access to essential services, and safeguarding the dignity and rights of all affected populations. The world needs peaceful coexistence where communities can live without fear and children grow up safely. We call for an immediate end to hostilities and urge all parties to fully respect their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians and to provide justice and effective redress for victims. The special procedures stand ready to support the Council and all relevant actors in addressing the human rights implications of this crisis, promoting accountability, and advancing efforts towards de-escalation and lasting peace. Finally, our thoughts are with the families of the victims and the survivors who now face unimaginable trauma. The killing of children can never, ever be justified. Thank you.
I thank the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, who spoke on behalf of the Coordination Committee of Special Procedures. And I would like to remind the Special Procedures that the Council has affected the time-saving measures on 9 February 2026 to remind them of time limits when speaking before the Council, as everybody else. I now give the floor to Ms. Mohadese Falahet, mother of 2 children killed in the strike on the school in Minab.
President, ladies and gentlemen, I'm a mother who even now, when passing by my kids' room, feels the urge to open the door and see them sleeping in their beds as always, or sitting there drawing. But the room is silent, much more silent than any home should ever be. That morning was like any other. It was routine for me to straighten their shoes by the door, comb their hair, and put their backpacks on their shoulders. There was no sign that this would be the last time. As they walked out the door, they simply said, "Mum, come pick us up after school." That simple sentence now repeats in my mind 1,000 times, and each time my heart burns with pain. No mother ever thinks she will send her child off to school with a smile, only to be met with silence. No mother is prepared to hear the words, "Your child is not coming back." These days, whenever I see any child for a moment, I think, maybe if it were my kids, Mahdiye and Mayamin, he or she would be running just like that, laughing just like that, living just like that. The clothes I bought with such joy for the new year and Nowruz are still there, their notebooks left unfinished, and their dreams they never had the chance to continue writing. I'm not just a grieving mother. No, I am the voice of all the mothers who sent their children to school believing they would be safe. A school was meant to be a place for learning, laughing, and building the future, a safe place for the children who were supposed to build the future of this world, not a place where their future is extinguished in an instant. I call upon the Human Rights Council and its members, upon the responsible institutions, and upon all those who have the ability and the duty to defend the lives of children, not to let this tragedy be forgotten. The truth must be brought to light, and Israel and the United States, who are the cause of this suffering, must be held accountable, not for revenge, but for justice, so that the world knows that children's lives are not worthless and that no parent should ever again have to endure such a weight. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Syed Abbas Arakchi, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Distinguished delegates, dear colleagues. Iran stands today amid the throes of an illegal war imposed by two bullying nuclear-armed regimes, the United States and Israel. This war of aggression is blatantly unjustified and brutal. They initiated this aggression on 28 February, while Iran and the United States were engaged in a diplomatic process to resolve Americans' alleged concerns over Iran's nuclear program. They betrayed diplomacy for a second time in the course of 9 months by torpedoing the negotiating table. Among the most harrowing manifestations of this aggression was the calculated, phased assault on Shajar Tayyib Elementary School in the city of Minab, south of Iran, where more than 175 students and teachers were slaughtered in cold blood. This barbaric attack is but the visible tip of a far bigger iceberg, one that conceals beneath its surface far graver catastrophes, namely the normalization of the most abhorrent violations of human rights and humanitarian law, and the audacity to commit atrocity crimes with impunity. Mr. President, at a time when the American-Israeli aggressors, in their own assertions, possess the most advanced technologies and the highest precision military and data systems, no one can believe that the attack on the school was anything other than deliberate and intentional. Targeting Shajar Tayyib School was a war crime and a crime against humanity, one that demands unequivocal condemnation by all and unambiguous accountability for the culprits. This atrocity cannot be justified, cannot be concealed, and must not be met with silence and indifference. The attack on Shajar Tayyib School in Minab was not a mere incident nor a miscalculation. The United States' contradictory remarks aimed at justifying their crime could not, in any manner, elude their responsibility. To denounce such a merciless assault on a place inherently civilian, a place where the most innocents reside and pursue knowledge, is not merely a legal obligation under human rights frameworks. It is a moral and human imperative. Our conscience will judge us more profoundly than any tribunal ever could. Distinguished delegates, Shajar Tayyib Elementary School has not been the only casualty of American-Israeli atrocity crimes during the past 27 days of their illegal war. Human rights and international humanitarian law have been massively and systematically violated by the invaders in an unprecedentedly brutal manner. They are targeting civilians and civilian infrastructures with no regard for laws of war and basic principles of humanity and civility. More than 600 schools have been demolished or damaged across Iran, and more than 1,000 students and teachers martyred or wounded as the result. The aggressors, who are arrogantly shouting, "No mercy, no quarters," and threatening to strike Iran's vital infrastructure, have been attacking hospitals, ambulances, health workers, Red Crescent rescuers, refineries, water sources, and residential areas. War crime and crime against humanity are not sufficiently describing the gravity of the atrocities they are committing. The aggressors' targeting pattern, accompanied by their rhetoric, leave little doubt as to their clear intent to commit genocide. Distinguished colleagues, this unjust war of whims by the United States and Israel against the noble nation of Iran is the direct result of silence in the face of earlier manifestations of lawlessness and atrocity in occupied Palestine, Lebanon, and elsewhere. Indifference and silence in the face of injustices would bring no security and peace. It would invite more insecurity and right violations. The United Nations and the core values it embodies, as well as the overall human rights framework, are at serious stake. You all need to call out the aggressors and let them know that the community of states, the human collective conscience, hold them accountable for the abhorrent crimes they are committing against Iranians. Iran has never sought war. Iranians are a peaceful, noble nation inheriting one of the richest civilizations on earth. Yet, they have demonstrated absolute resolve and determination to defend themselves against the brutal aggressors who know no boundary in perpetrating all sorts of crimes, a defense that shall persist as long as needed. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Before we proceed with the list of speakers, allow me to request to all delegations to deal with human rights issues with dignity, and also remind all of you to adhere to the well-established principles of the United Nations, and this includes to uphold UN standards when referring to countries. The list of speakers is now closed, and we shall now begin with the list of members of the Council, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Norway on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. On behalf of Iceland and Norway, we welcome this urgent debate. The Middle East is on fire. Human suffering is severe and immediate. Beyond the region, it has growing and profound consequences on global stability, on energy and food security. We are deeply alarmed by the human rights and humanitarian crisis caused by the warfare, with civilians displaced, injured and killed across the region. On the first day of the war, more than 170 children were deplorably killed when the girls' school in Minab was hit. And since then, several schools, hospitals, energy infrastructure and other civilian objects have also been hit, increasing risk to all civilians. This is unacceptable. We call on all parties to respect IHL and to use the tools of the Safe Schools Declaration to protect children and education. Neither the US and Israeli strikes against Iran, nor the Iranian attacks on countries in the region are in accordance with international law. The human rights situation in Iran, especially with regards to women and girls, is intolerable. Once again, we call on the Islamic Republic of Iran to respect all human rights for all. President, we call on the parties to end the war and to find diplomatic solutions to unlock the current stalemate in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, I speak on behalf of the EU. Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Liechtenstein, North Macedonia, Moldova, Montenegro and Ukraine align themselves with this statement. The EU deplores the loss of all civilian life and calls for an immediate end to strikes against civilian infrastructure. We call for de-escalation and restraint, protection of civilians and respect of international law, including the UN Charter, by all parties. We are deeply saddened by the loss of children's lives in Iran, including those killed in the strike against the school in Minab. The EU calls on all parties to take all measures to ensure children's rights are fully respected. Attacks against civilian objects constitute a violation of IHL. We call on all parties to take necessary measures to protect children, including ensuring that civilian facilities are not attacked. The EU calls on Iran to cease violence and repression against its own people. The EU calls for the respect of the rights and freedoms of the Iranian people. The EU has taken targeted restrictive measures against those responsible for serious human rights violations in Iran and will continue to do so as long as necessary. The EU fully supports the work of the FFM and of the SR. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, President. The group of Friends in Defence of the United Nations Charter welcomes this initiative of Iran, China and Cuba to hold an urgent debate. We vehemently condemn the killing of 168 children at Minab Primary School in the Islamic Republic of Iran on the 28th of February. The United States and Israel must respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We are deeply worried at the attack on Minab Primary School, which led to the deaths of nearly 170 children and many more were injured. Attacks on schools are war crimes. All states have the basic responsibility to protect children, ensure full enjoyment of human rights, and to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law in the context of armed conflict. We're deeply worried at the growing threats to civilian infrastructure as well as the environmental impacts of acid rain and the poisoning which results from attacks on oil infrastructure. The long-term consequences of these acts will go beyond the current generations. We call for distinction, proportionality and precaution to be fully respected during hostilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Indonesia strongly condemns the deliberate attack against Sajareh Tayyab's girls' school in Minab, carried out in the context of the unprovoked military campaign by the US and Israel across Iran. We extend our deepest condolences to the people of Iran, particularly the families of the victims. Across the Middle East, we have seen thousands of schools in Gaza, Iran, and Lebanon, along with hospitals and homes have been destroyed in patterns of this attack. No military or political justification can excuse the killing of children. This attack reflects a method of warfare we have seen in Gaza. Repeated strikes on civilian infrastructure where harm to civilians is part of a broader pattern resulting in widespread destruction. This Council has to recognize the growing application of Israel-Gaza method, where children and families are assassinated for political and military purposes. Francesca Albanese clearly warned us about this. I call on this Council to recognize this danger. The growing grave violation of international humanitarian and human rights law may amount to war crimes in Iran and across the region. Accountability is essential, and this Council must not allow silence or selectivity to embolden impunity. Indonesia therefore calls for an independent and impartial investigation, full accountability for those responsible, and comprehensive redress for victims. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
Mr. President, Ethiopia reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, including the prohibition of the use of force and the peaceful resolution of disputes. We express our grave concern over the deteriorating situation in the Middle East and urgently call for an immediate cessation of hostilities. We extend our condolences to the families of the victims and to all those affected by the ongoing violence in the region. We urge all parties to exercise maximum restraint, take all feasible measures to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, and fully comply with international humanitarian and human rights law. Ethiopia calls upon the international community to redouble its efforts towards de-escalation and to place renewed emphasis on dialogue and diplomacy as the only viable path to sustainable peace and lasting stability. In closing, Ethiopia remains ready to constructively engage with and support all credible initiatives aimed at advancing peace, strengthening security, and fostering stability. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. Children are most vulnerable victims, and they're the ones that we should particularly protect during armed conflict. Humanity should spare no effort to guarantee the future of our planet. All parties to armed conflicts must understand that if they do not do this, then they are crossing unforgivable red lines. Colombia vehemently condemns the attack on Minab Primary School, which took the life of nearly 200 girls. And we offer our solidarity to all the victims of hostilities in the Middle East. And we deeply regret the fact that hundreds of civilians have suffered the consequences of the escalation of violence arising from the military aggression of the United States and Israel against Iran. As the High Commissioner Special Rapporteur for Iran and the International Investigation Mission for Iran have mentioned, all parties to conflict must respect the principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution, and respect the protection that they must provide under international humanitarian law to schools and education, and apply the guidelines for preventing the military use of schools and universities during armed conflicts. We must ensure that this kind of tragedy is not repeated, and that these facts do not go unpunished, and that those held accountable be brought to book. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. We'd like to thank the sponsoring countries for having convened this debate. Mexico shares the deep concern at the widespread impact on human rights resulting from the escalation of the conflict in the Middle East, which began on the 28th of February. Mexico offers its solidarity to all affected governments and peoples, and we deeply regret the humanitarian impact of this conflict, which is affecting the most vulnerable people, particularly girls, who suffer a differentiated impact because of factors such as gender and age. We particularly deplore attacks against schools, such as the attack on Minab school, as well as against hospitals and basic civilian infrastructure, which are tantamount to flagrant violations of international humanitarian law. The loss of young lives in armed conflict is an unacceptable tragedy and a violation of their fundamental rights, including their right to life. The Geneva Conventions call for protection of civilians and to distinguish between military and civilian objects, including schools. So we urge all parties to enter into dialogue and find a peaceful solution to this dispute and respect international humanitarian law and international human rights law. This is the only way to put a stop to this conflict. Thank you very much, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
Mr. President, the attack on the Sharajah Tayyip Girls' School in Minab, Iran, which claimed the lives of 168 innocent girls, is a breach of the bottom line of human morality, the most egregious violation of human rights, and blatant contempt for IHL. China is deeply shocked by the attack. We strongly condemn it and express our sympathies for the families of the victims. The U.S. and Israel launched the attack on Iran without the authorization of the Security Council, which is the root cause of this tragedy. The U.S. and Israel killed Iran's leaders, seriously violated the human rights of the Iranian people, and triggered an escalation of conflicts in the Middle East, forcibly drawing regional countries into the situation. The sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of all countries should be fully respected. China strongly condemns all acts that violate international law and indiscriminately target civilians and non-military objectives. All hotspot issues should be resolved through dialogue and negotiation, not through the use of force. All parties must seize every opportunity for peace. Launch the peace process in good faith. Take practical actions to protect the basic human rights of the people in the region and safeguard peace and stability in the Middle East. Thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. India remains deeply concerned at the evolving situation in West Asia. As a proximate neighbor with critical stakes in the security and stability of the region, these developments evoke great anxiety. India expresses profound grief over the loss of precious lives due to the attack on the Sharajah Tayyip Girls' School in Minab. This tragedy underlines once again the urgent need to ensure that schools, hospitals, energy, and other civilian infrastructure are never targets in situations of armed conflict. India reiterates that there is no alternative to dialogue and diplomacy. India has consistently urged all sides to exercise restraint, avoid escalation, and prioritize the safety of civilians. All outstanding issues must be addressed through peaceful means with full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. Mr. President, India stands ready to support all constructive efforts aimed at de-escalation, fostering dialogue, and promoting lasting peace, stability, and security in West Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iraq.
Thank you, Mr. President. This urgent debate takes place in a serious context because of the escalation of military operations that affected Iraq, the region, and the world in a dark threat of stability and security and a violent, flagrant violation of the basic principles and norms of international law. This puts at risk the economic interests and the civility of civilians. We strongly condemn any attack against children, educational institutions in armed conflicts, because this is a flagrant violation of the principles of IHL and the international human rights law. Targeting schools is also a flagrant violation of human rights and a direct threat to the future and stability of communities. Iraq reiterates that the protection of children in armed conflicts is the common responsibility of the international community. We reiterate our call for the respect of the rights of children at all times, preserving their dignity and rights. We reiterate that the expansion of war would deepen crises, undermine stability, and we call for dialogue as a way to peacefully resolve differences and achieve peace and stability. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. As consistently underlined throughout this Human Rights Council session, Slovenia condemns the military escalation by all parties in the Middle East. This war is fueling dangerous regional instability, profound human suffering and destruction. Numerous young lives have deplorably been lost, the girls' lives at the school in Minab, as well as in other parts of the region. International humanitarian law is clear. Attacks on schools are prohibited. The Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols impose obligations to afford special protection to children. The Convention on the Rights of the Child reinforces the right to education, even during conflict. Within the Children and Armed Conflict framework, attacks against schools and hospitals are recognized as one of the 6 grave violations against children. Despite these clear norms, deliberate or indiscriminate targeting of schools, educational facilities, teachers and students are increasing in both frequency and scale. Perpetrators of grave violations against children and against civilians in general must be brought to justice in line with international law and standards. To conclude, Mr. President, Slovenia reiterates its call on all parties in this conflict for de-escalation, maximum restraint and full respect of international law. Only diplomacy and negotiations in good faith are a viable path towards peace and security for children and civilians in the region. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Spain.
Thank you, President. Spain endorses the EU statement. On the 28th of February, the illegal bombing by Israel and the US has triggered another dangerous escalation of violence in the Middle East. There's also been unacceptable waves of attacks since then. We condemn all violations of international humanitarian law and the UN Charter. The pupils and teachers of Minab school were also the victims of a breach of international law. We hope that the fact-finding mission, the Special Rapporteur on the human rights in Iran, will shed light on who is accountable. Spain is committed to justice and transparency. We shouldn't trivialise the killing of children through bombings as mere collateral damage of conflicts. When you destroy a school, you destroy the future of a generation. That's why Spain firmly believes in the Safe Schools Declaration, which it has signed. But we must be coherent. Whilst Iran has convened this urgent debate, the authorities in that country are carrying out summary killings and repress their people because they want to freely express themselves and demonstrate. And Masha Amini is just an example of the particular victimization of girls and women. Spain calls for everyone to respect international law and a return to diplomacy, above all to avoid future atrocities. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Brazil strongly condemns the bombing of the education facility in Minab that resulted in the deaths of 168 schoolgirls aged between 7 and 12, along with their educators. This act constitutes a grave violation of human rights and humanitarian law. We are currently witnessing an erosion of multilateralism, alongside systematic disregard for international law, including international human rights law and international humanitarian law. This appears to have become a constant across various global conflicts. The current situation in the Middle East would justify a comprehensive and non-selective debate in this Council, Mr. President, one that addresses human rights violations in the entire region and the responsibilities of all parties involved in the hostilities. It would also demand the fulfillment of international obligations to protect civilians, and we regret that the path of fragmentation has prevailed over a holistic approach to the crisis. We recall that the protection of children in armed conflict will be the subject of a specific resolution during this 61st session presented by GRULEC and the European Union. To conclude, let me be clear. Children must be protected at all times and without exception. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Merci. Thank you, President. The war in the Middle East is a serious threat to security in the region and must be stopped forthwith. It's only by respecting international law and returning to diplomacy that we will ensure that there is lasting stability and security in the region. The bombing of the Minab school led to an outpouring of emotion. France offers its condolences to the families of the victims, and we hope that those accountable will be held to account for this tragedy. We call for respect by all parties to international humanitarian law. It's vital to swiftly put a stop to the targeting of civilian infrastructure in order to protect civilians and ensure access to basic services such as energy production. But France doesn't forget that Iran deliberately and systematically targets civilians and civilian infrastructure, and we firmly condemn that. We don't forget either the multiple human rights violations committed by the regime, and we stand in solidarity with the Iranian people. France supports the renewal of the mandates, the fact-finding mission, and special rapporteur in order to document violations, particularly bearing in mind the brutal repression of demonstrations in Iran in January. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before I give the floor to the next delegation, let me remind all of you to adhere to the well-established principle of the United Nations to uphold UN standards when referring to countries. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Señor Presidente,
President, on the 28th of February, the United States and Israel launched a military attack on Iran. This is a flagrant violation of the UN Charter and international law. Cuba firmly condemns this aggression, and we call for it to immediately cease. As a result of the attack on the Minab primary school, 168 Iranian girls were murdered and many others were injured. There were horrendous images of classrooms that were turned into ruins. but those who are responsible have not even offered an apology. This is not just a one-off. Many other civilian objects have been attacked in Iran. Schools are protected spaces. There's no justification for bombing a school which is full of children. This is not collateral damage. This is a war crime. This council must condemn the tragedy in Minab and ignore ideological differences in this regard. This is why we convened this urgent debate. We must ensure the inviolability of schools. This is not selective. There must be an independent and impartial investigation into this incident in order to ensure those who are responsible are held accountable. Pain doesn't end, and victims have a right to truth and reparation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Mr. President, we are appalled by all reports of civilian deaths in Minab, in Iran, and across the region. Innocent civilians should never be caught in the crossfire. Our thoughts are with the victims and their families. We support all action that will help bring a swift end to this conflict. Mr. President, even in times of conflict, we cannot ignore Iran's own human rights record, which remains dire. Just 2 months ago, this Council met to condemn the brutal killing of thousands of Iranian protesters exercising their right to peaceful protest. Iran's abhorrent use of the death penalty and continued internet restrictions fuel cycles of repression for the people of Iran. The UK will continue to work with international partners, including the UN fact-finding mission and the Special Rapporteur, to hold Iran to account for its repression of women and girls, religious and ethnic minorities, and human rights defenders. We know it takes huge bravery to protest and to speak out in the face of this oppression, especially for women and girls who continue to endure severe repression in their daily lives. Mr. President, the UK demands that the Iranian authorities fully respect human rights and fundamental freedoms of all people in Iran. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Angola.
Mr. President, a strike against a school constitutes a grave violation of the rights of children and on education itself, undermining the very foundation of the future of any society. Such acts are particularly alarming as they target those who are most vulnerable and jeopardize the prospects of entire communities. Schools, civilian objects, and children benefit from explicit protection under the international humanitarian law. Accordingly, any attack against them is strictly prohibited. Angola expresses its deep concern over the escalation tensions in the region, which continue to exacerbate this instability and contribute to the deterioration of the human rights and humanitarian situation. In this regard, Angola calls for maximum restraint by all parties, emphasizing that further intensification of hostilities will only deepen human suffering and hinder prospects for peace. Angola's position remains firmly grounded in its unwavering respect for the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, namely the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, the peaceful settlement of disputes, and the prohibition of the use of the force outside the framework of international law. The Middle East deserves to live in peace, stability, and sustainable development. In this regard, it is the collective responsibility of the international community, including this Council, to act with urgency and determination to prevent further escalation and to promote meaningful pathways for dialogue, de-escalation, and reconciliation. I thank you, Mr. President.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mauritius.
Thank you, President. Mauritius notes with concern the escalation of hostilities in the Middle East that has caused civilian casualties and destruction of civilian infrastructure and property. We condemn the reckless and indiscriminate attack on the girls' school in Minab, which resulted in loss of lives of civilians, in particular girls aged between 7 and 12. This is a serious breach of international humanitarian law. Such attacks are a violation of the CRC, its optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict, the 4th Geneva Convention, and the Safe Schools Declaration, which call for the protection of children and education in conflict. Children and educational institutions should never be a target. Yet, unfortunately, we see this happening again and again. We call on all parties to the conflict to exercise restraint and to respect and uphold international humanitarian law and human rights law. We further call, once again, for a cessation of hostilities. Civilians should not and never pay the price of an armed conflict. Any resolution of the situation must be pursued in accordance with the principles and purposes of the UN Charter and the fundamental principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We are deeply concerned about the ongoing escalation in the Middle East and recall our statement made during Wednesday's urgent debate on Iran's attacks against the GCC and Jordan. Our thoughts are with the families of the children that tragically lost their lives in the strike of a school in Minab on the 28th of February. We call for an immediate end of all attacks targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, including schools, which must remain safe spaces for learning and are protected under international humanitarian law. Children must be protected at all times from direct and indirect effects of hostilities. We support the ongoing monitoring and investigation of the International Independent Fact-Finding Mission and the Special Rapporteur, and ask for adequate resources and institutional support so that they can carry out their independent monitoring and investigative work. Widespread human rights violations persist unabated in Iran, which we condemn. We call upon Iran to provide full access to the country. Mr. President, we call for de-escalation and maximum restraint and call on all parties to comply with obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. President. Italy aligns itself with the statement of the European Union. We express our condolences and deep sorrow for the loss of 165 school children following the attack on a school in Minab. Italy is particularly concerned about the severe impact of the ongoing military escalation in the region on civilians and their human rights. Children are among the most vulnerable victims of conflicts and continue to suffer unacceptable violence. In this regard, international humanitarian law serves both as a legal obligation and as a warning. It recognizes general protection against attacks on military use of schools and civilian objects. Even when they do not cause casualties, attacks on schools immediately affect children's right to education and the reconstruction of post-conflict societies. As a supporter of the Safe Schools Declaration, Italy will continue to encourage other countries to endorse and implement the declaration. Mr. President, children must be always protected, both in war and in peace. We urge the Iranian authorities to uphold their international obligations, including by stopping all executions, especially of minors convicted of crimes committed before they were 18 years old. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Mr. President. Earlier this month, the Deputy High Commissioner reminded us that war is the ultimate violation of a child's right. Yet, as reflected by the topic of this urgent debate, it is children who are bearing the brunt of the military escalation in the Middle East. South Africa condemns the aerial attack on Sharaje Tayeb Girls' School, resulting in the death of 168 children. This horrific act not only shattered the lives of innocent children and teachers, but also struck at the very core of what schools represent, the promise of a brighter future. We therefore express our most profound condolences with the families of all victims and solidarity with survivors. In so doing, we wish to remind all parties of their obligations to uphold international law, including international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and the UN Charter. The children of the region deserve better. Schools must remain safe havens where young minds can thrive fear from fear. We thus urge the parties to de-escalate and use dialogue as a means of resolving the conflict instead of beating the drums of war. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thailand is profoundly saddened by the attack on girls' schools in Minab and the tragic loss of civilian lives, most of them innocent children. We extend our sincere condolences to all victims and their families. Thailand reaffirms the principles enshrined in the UN Charter, including non-use of force and peaceful resolution of dispute. This war should never have happened. We regret that diplomacy was not given a chance. We are gravely concerned by the escalating situation and its widening humanitarian impact, both within Iran and across the region. Attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructures are unacceptable. Medical facilities, schools, residential areas, and essential energy infrastructures must be protected as they sustain civilian lives and livelihoods. Thailand calls for strict compliance with international human rights and humanitarian law. We are also concerned by the growing global consequences of this conflict, with significant economic and social repercussions and implications for international peace and security. Thailand calls on all parties to exercise maximum restraint, cease hostilities, de-escalate tensions, and urgently return to dialogue and diplomacy towards peaceful resolution grounded in international law and the UN Charter. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Mr. President, Vietnam unequivocally opposes the use of force against targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. We express deep concern over civilian casualties resulting from the ongoing conflicts in the region, particularly among girls and other vulnerable groups. The targeting of schools and educational facilities is especially concerning as it deprives children of safety, dignity, and their fundamental right to education. Civilians, schools, and essential civilian infrastructure must be protected under all circumstances. Vietnam calls on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and to fully comply with international law, in particular international humanitarian law, the UN Charter, and the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of states in the region. We call for an immediate end to all escalatory actions and urge the resumption of negotiations. Vietnam expresses its support for the efforts of all relevant countries and international organizations to de-escalate tensions, promote dialogue, and seek peaceful solutions to the conflict. We wish to recall that Vietnam, together with ASEAN member states, issued an ASEAN Foreign Minister's statement on the situation in the Middle East on the 4th of March. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Across conflict zones and situations of foreign occupation around the world, millions of children are growing up amid rubble and trauma rather than in classrooms or playgrounds. Pakistan offers its sincere condolences to civilian victims, their families, and communities. The unconscionable deaths of schoolgirls in Iran weigh heavily on our minds, as do those of civilian victims in Gulf countries, including Pakistani expatriates. Across the Middle East, tens of thousands of innocent victims have seen their lives cut short. Others bear lifelong injury or psychological scars that may never heal. The haunting voice of Hind Rajab will always echo for the children of Gaza. Countless child victims and war orphans remind us of how far we are from an environment which fosters the health, self-respect, and dignity of the child promised by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We reiterate our condemnation of the unwarranted attacks against the Islamic Republic of Iran in violation of international law. We condemn also the unjustifiable attacks against our brotherly countries from the GCC and Jordan. Their continued restraint is commendable. This war must end. A comprehensive and lasting peace must be our goal. All actions that prolong the conflict and increase its immense human cost must be avoided. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. We think it's crucial for this Council to tackle
The situation under this specific mandate focused on human dignity and protection of human rights of affected persons. Protection of civilians, especially of children, in context of conflict should be a top priority for this Council. It's crucial to recall that they are those who bear the brunt of armed conflict. Current trends reflected in the most recent report of the Special Representative to the Secretary-General for Children in Armed Conflict highlights an alarming landscape with a significant deterioration when it comes to their protection. Among the most violated rights is the right to education, which is crucial for guaranteeing sustainable peace and resilience of future generations. Guaranteeing access to education is a key tool for integration of children affected by conflict and contributes directly to the SDGs. We call on all parties to deliver on their obligations under international law, human rights and IHL with a view to a definitive cessation of hostilities. The only way that children and their families can stop losing their lives and can fully enjoy their rights is through dialogue, peaceful dispute resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, Japan thanks the High Commissioner and other speakers for their inputs. The peace and stability of the Middle East, including the safety of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz, is of utmost importance to Japan. We are deeply concerned about the ongoing deterioration of the regional situation surrounding Iran, which has serious implications for the protection and promotion of human rights. The protection of human rights is a basic responsibility of all nations. It is essential that the international community continue dialogue and cooperation with a view to fulfilling this responsibility. As a country that respects fundamental values and principles such as freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, Japan will continue to make all necessary diplomatic efforts in coordination with the international community to bring about an early de-escalation of the situation, thereby also improving secure access to safe and quality education in the region, which is fundamental to the future. In this regard, Japan remains open to dialogue with all stakeholders, including Iran, to further exchange views on efforts to promote and protect the human rights of all individuals. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Gambia.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Gambia expresses deep concern and strongly condemns the missile struck on Sajere Taibe Girls Elementary School in Minab, which resulted in the loss of civilian lives, including more than 100 innocent children. We extend our sincere condolences to the government and people of the Islamic Republic of Iran on this tragic loss. We recall the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which affirms the right of every child to life and protection from violence. We also recall the Safe Schools Declaration of 2015, which emphasizes the imperative of ensuring that schools remain safe spaces for learning, even in the midst of armed conflict. The protection of children, educational and health institutions must remain a priority at all times. We further emphasize the obligation of all states under international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions, to ensure full respect for the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution in the conduct of hostilities. We call on all parties to the current conflict to recommit to the fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter, including respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, as well as the obligation to resolve disputes through peaceful means. In line with its mandate, the Council must live up to its obligation of addressing human rights violations whenever they occur. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic.
Thank you, President. The Dominican Republic expresses its profound concern at the attacks against children and education institutions in the context of armed conflict. Protection of childhood is a central obligation of international law. In particular, schools, as assets of a civilian nature, should be respected and protected at all times. As per the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and its customary laws, parties in a conflict are obliged to distinguish between civilians and combatants, as well as between civilian objects and military objectives. We reaffirm our commitment to the fundamental principles of international law, especially IHL and international human rights law. Similarly, we underscore the importance of the resolution on the exercise of the rights of children in armed conflict, which is supported by the Dominican state. So this urgent debate should serve to enhance the commitment of the international community to the effective protection of children in armed conflict and to accountability for grave violations of IHL. The Dominican Republic reiterates that respect for international law and strengthening multilateralism are the only legitimate means to prevent conflict and build lasting peace. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Thank you. Switzerland is profoundly concerned by the current escalation. Protection of civilian populations and of civilian infrastructure is an obligation for all parties under IHL and human rights law. It must be an absolute priority. We are appalled by attacks against educational infrastructure, especially against the girls' school in Iran. As civilian facilities, they must be protected in all circumstances. This is a grave violation of international law that Switzerland condemns. Given these developments, Switzerland expresses its solidarity with the victims and all populations affected by this conflict. At the same time, Switzerland firmly condemns the violent repression in Iran and executions tied to the recent protests and calls on the Iranian authorities not to carry out any additional executions. Switzerland reminds all parties to respect international law, especially the UN Charter, IHL and human rights law. Respect for the prohibition on use of force is essential. The actions of the United States and Israel against Iran, as well as acts by Iran exceeding the framework of the right to legitimate self-defense, are a cause for grave concern. Switzerland calls for maximum restraint and an immediate cessation to hostilities. It remains committed as a neutral actor to promoting de-escalation, respect for international law and its good offices. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kenya.
Mr. President, the tragic attack on Shajareh Tayyebe Girls' School in Minab, Iran on 28 February and the reported loss of over 160 young lives represents the devastating human cost when civilian sites, particularly schools, are impacted in conflict. My delegation expresses our deep condolences to the families of the victims. Mr. President, Kenya underscores our long-standing commitments to civilian protection. As a champion of these principles, we hosted the 5th International Conference on the Safe Schools Declaration in Nairobi in November 2025, during which 121 endorsing states advanced concrete measures to strengthen safeguards against attacks on schools, prohibit their military use, promote safe access to education, and enhance support for affected students and teachers. We call on all parties to armed conflict to comply fully with their IHL obligations, including the special protections afforded to children and civilian objects. We further call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint, prioritize dialogue, and address security concerns through diplomatic mechanisms. Urgent de-escalation remains paramount to safeguard civilians and restore sustainable peace across the region. We further urge all states to prioritize practical steps that shield the most vulnerable and preserve education as a foundation for peace. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Albania.
Monsieur le Président,
President Albania expresses profound concern at the rapid, dangerous escalation of the situation in the Middle East. As ever in all armed conflicts, it's civilians who pay the highest price. Unfortunately, that's the case of the children at Minab and their teachers. Albania hopes that the International Independent Fact-Finding Mission on Iran, mandated by this Council, can provide findings and evidence with a view to future accountability process. The FFM will have our full support. Albania calls for immediate de-escalation, for protection of civilians and essential infrastructure, as well as the urgent relaunching of a credible diplomatic process. So, in Iran, ordinary citizens have been abducted, have been stripped of their dignity and freedom. Many have paid the price with their lives, their freedom and security. Their courage means that we must not look away. Iran must put an end to its repression and its violence against its own people, and which has gone on for decades. Albania stands side by side with the Iranian people and their legitimate aspirations to freedom, dignity and justice. I thank you.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, we shall now proceed with the list of observers of the Council, and I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia.
Thank you, President. Australia remains deeply concerned that the conflict in the Middle East continues to endanger civilian lives. Since the outbreak of hostilities, Australia has called on all parties to uphold international humanitarian law and protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. Vulnerable cohorts, especially children, are disproportionately affected by war. Attacks against schools, education infrastructure, and teachers deprives children of the right to learn in safety and shelter from conflict for which they are not responsible. We urge all parties to conflict to prioritise the protection of education, safeguard schools as civilian spaces, and ensure every child has access to safety, learning and hope. On the 9th of March 2026, Australia joined a statement in this forum alongside other nations who have endorsed the Safe Schools Declaration. We reaffirm today that the right to education must be respected during armed conflict. This is grounded in international law and is the cornerstone of the children and armed conflict agenda. Children deserve more than survival. They deserve a future. We have a responsibility to make it possible. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
President, Ireland aligns with the statement of the European Union. Ireland recalls that international humanitarian law applies to all parties in the conduct of military operations and must be upheld. Current conflicts in the region undermine the human rights of all. We reiterate our call for de-escalation and maximum restraint, the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and full respect for international law by all parties. Ireland is appalled by the bombing of the school in Minab, in which at least 110 children were killed, and offers its condolences to their families. Any killing of children is abhorrent. This must not become normalised as a collateral consequence of war in the Middle East or elsewhere. Thousands of people have been affected by aerial bombardment, drone and missile attacks and displacement across the region. The killing of over 200 children in Iran, over 100 in Lebanon, 4 in Israel and 1 in Kuwait since 28 February is deeply concerning. Protection of civilians and children must be prioritised by parties to conflict. We call on all parties to cease violence and to comply with obligations under international law. Civilian infrastructure, including schools and buildings used for education purposes, must be protected during armed conflict. Those responsible for grave violations against children in armed conflict must be held accountable. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, President. We are seriously concerned by the ongoing armed confrontation in the Middle East and the risk of further escalation. We see ever more damage being inflicted on energy and other vital infrastructure in Iran and in neighbouring Arab states. For our part, we are in favour for a swift cessation by all parties of hostilities and the adoption of exhaustive measures to ensure security of civilians and civilian infrastructure in all countries in the region. We strenuously condemn the strike on the girls' school in Minab that took the lives of innocent children. Any attacks on civilian objects, be it in Iran or the Arab countries, are unacceptable and there must be no place for them. We call for a swift cessation of hostilities that was a result of the unprovoked aggression by the US and Israel against Iran. Russia is ready to facilitate settlement of the raging conflict and seek solutions to existing differences through political diplomatic means with a view to achieving long-term sustainable stabilization in the region that takes into account the interests of all states. We underscore the need to create conditions for coexistence in peace, security and an atmosphere of good neighbourliness between the friendly Arab countries and Iran. The first step to that goal should be immediate. Should be the US and Israel immediately putting a stop to this military escalation and escapade. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Libya.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. بداية نتقدم بالتعازي.
Thank you. First of all, we want to express our condolences to the families of the children in the Shajara Tayyiba school. We believe that targeting civilians is a violation of IHL, something that we firmly condemn. It's the children who pay the highest price of conflict. It's important to respect international humanitarian law, as well as the need to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, including schools and hospitals in times of war, in line with international humanitarian law. We underscore the need to be guided by that right. We condemn the ongoing Israeli attacks against the Palestinian people and against the Islamic Republic of Iran and against Lebanon, a brother country. This threatens international and regional peace and security. We call on the international community to shoulder its responsibilities by putting an end to those violations and ensuring accountability for the perpetrators. In conclusion, we share the appeal of the UN Secretary General for an end to the war, saying that diplomacy was the only appropriate solution. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium.
Mr. President, Belgium aligns itself with the EU statement. Let me start with a clear message to the initiator of this urgent debate. Iran must stop violently repressing its own population. We condemn this repression in the strongest terms. Iranians deserve to fully enjoy their human rights to strive for a more dignified and democratic future. On the focus of this debate, as we know, IHL is about balancing military necessity with the principle of humanity. Unfortunately, at times, this balance is strained when the conduct of parties to a conflict departs from the humanitarian constraints that the law is designed to uphold. This is particularly evident when schools, hospitals and other civilian objects, each expressly protected under IHL, are targeted. In this regard, and like the High Commissioner, we welcome the ongoing investigations announced by the US authorities and call for these to be completed in a prompt, thorough, independent, impartial and transparent manner. We furthermore urge Iran to instantly cease all of its own indiscriminate attacks. We strongly condemn Iran's attacks against inter alia, residential areas, hotels, diplomatic missions, civilian airports, economic centers, ports, and energy infrastructure. To conclude, we repeat our call for immediate de-escalation and maximum restraint, and for the full respect of the core principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions, which regulate the conduct of armed conflict. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Maldives.
Mr. President, the Maldives is deeply alarmed by the continued escalation of conflict in the Middle East following the military attacks initiated by Israel and the United States against Iran. We extend our deepest condolences to the victims and their families and wish speedy recovery to those injured. Schools are not targets. Children are not targets. The Maldives unequivocally condemned the attacks on a girls' school in Minab that resulted in the death of more than 170 children. Such acts constitute a serious violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Israel, already a serial violator of international law and a sponsor of state terrorism, is at the core of fueling this conflict and destruction, reflecting a pattern of continued aggression that has plunged GCC countries and Jordan, as well as Palestine and Lebanon, into crisis. We stress the urgent need to end the long-standing culture of impunity enjoyed by Israel that has enabled such actions to persist. The Maldives reminds all parties of their international obligations and call on the international community to intensify efforts to de-escalate the situation, protect civilians, and ensure accountability. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bangladesh.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Bangladesh strongly condemns the attack on the Shajara Tayyiba Girls' School in Minab in Iran, resulting in the tragic killing of 168 innocent children. This egregious attack is a grave and flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. It is a collective moral failure of the global community that indiscriminate attacks on the civilians and civilian sites are continuing. Bangladesh is also deeply concerned over the ongoing escalation of the conflict in the region, which continues to pose a serious threat to the international peace and security and create a broader humanitarian impact. Bangladesh is not immune to the ongoing conflict, which has already resulted in tragic loss of lives of Bangladeshis working in the region and is placing significant strain on the country's energy security and economic stability. Therefore, Bangladesh once again calls for restraint, immediate de-escalation and cessation of hostilities by all parties and underscores that diplomacy and constructive dialogue must be allowed adequate opportunity in finding the just and lasting solution of the crisis. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uruguay.
President, as Uruguay mentioned on the 25th of March, the current situation caused by constant military attacks is having a huge impact on civil society, particularly children, adolescents, persons with disabilities, older persons and women. Here in this forum we've defended that civilians, hospitals, schools and energy plants, including hospitals and heating and cooling systems, have been attacked. This is a breach of the protection provided by Geneva Conventions. Similarly, hospitals, health staff, equipment, schools, pupils, teachers and non-teaching staff have been systematically attacked, causing thousands of civilian casualties. Uruguay is the pen holder of the resolution on the rights of children alongside the European Union. This year, the resolution refers to armed conflict. We make an urgent call in the resolution to protect children and vital systems such as education, health, food and security systems. The General Assembly resolution from the 9th of September, which declared it the International Day to protect education from attacks, reiterate the need to protect and respect schools in line with IHL and firmly condemns all attacks against schools and use of schools for military purposes. Uruguay, as a member of the rules-based international community, calls for military de-escalation and the basic rules to be respected and diplomacy to be reinitiated. Thank you.
Thank you. I call on the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone.
President, we are concerned by the reported aerial attacks on the school in Minab in Iran. Such incidents would raise serious concerns under international humanitarian law and human rights law regarding the protection of civilians and educational institutions. We acknowledge the confirmation by the United States authorities that the incident is under investigation. We welcome recent news of potential ceasefire discussions aimed at resolving the conflict and calls on all parties to pursue dialogue and diplomacy in good faith. De-escalation remains essential to prevent further civilian suffering and restore regional and global stability. As signatory to the Safe School Declaration, we acknowledge the importance of safeguarding students, educators and educational facilities from attacks and military use. Drawing from a post-conflict experience, we stress that protecting children is vital to sustainable peace. Attacks on children and disruption to education cause lasting trauma, displacement, social instability. All parties must respect IHL, international human rights law, and the Charter of the United Nations. We are also concerned about the wider global impact of the conflict. Disruptions to the Strait of Hormuz are affecting energy supply chains, with developing countries, including Sierra Leone, facing fuel shortages, rise in living costs, and economic strain. Continued hostilities keep risking deepening inequality and reversing development gains. And I thank you, President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Oman.
President, the Sultanate of Oman is deeply concerned by the serious developments in our region as a result of mutual attacks over the past month. Innocent civilians are bearing the brunt of this. There have been repercussions for vital systems in Iran and neighbouring countries. Targeting the Minab primary school has been one of the most deplorable incidents in the ongoing conflict. It is clearly a violation of international law and undermines international efforts to protect children, educational establishments during conflict. President, the Sultanate of Oman offers its condolences to the families of victims and calls for international humanitarian law to be respected, notably by avoiding targeting civilian objects for any reason. The Sultanate of Oman calls for restraint, international solidarity and respect for international law. We support all efforts by the international community to stop the war and call for negotiations and dialogue to be resumed, as this is the only way to ensure that everyone's interests are considered and for peace to be restored to our region. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus.
Thank you, President. We support the initiative of Iran, China and Cuba to hold this urgent Human Rights Council debate following the treacherous attack on Iran and airstrikes on education institutions as well as other civilian objects, leaving mass casualties among civilians, especially children. It's impossible to come to terms with the death of children, especially when this could and should have been avoided by continuing diplomatic negotiations in which Iran took part in a spirit of goodwill. It's important for the UN system, including its human rights mechanisms, to go beyond just pronouncements and expressions of concern and give a relevant assessment of these violations of international law, of international humanitarian law and human rights, which are being committed in Iran as a result of strikes on schools, hospitals and critical civilian infrastructure. We're particularly concerned by the destruction of energy facilities, leading to an environmental catastrophe in Tehran and to the threats to the health of millions of people. And going through with threats against the electric power station, nuclear station in Iran would be an irreversible tragedy going well beyond the borders of that country. Belarus, above all, values preserving peace and security, in the absence of which human rights can't be achieved. We express our hope for a swift cessation to the armed confrontation and restoration of peace that the Middle East, the population of the Middle East is so crying out for. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Venezuela.
Thank you, President. Venezuela vehemently condemns the murder of 168 children in Minab primary school in the Islamic Republic of Iran on the 28th of February. Venezuela offers its most sincere condolences to the Iranian people and government. Regrettably, this is once again a serious violation of international law, international humanitarian law and the United Nations Charter. And that's why Venezuela welcomes the Council's decision to hold an urgent debate on this situation upon the request of Iran, China and Cuba. There is absolutely no argument which can justify a deliberate attack against a school. This act is a direct attack on the human rights of the Iranian people and humanity as a whole. Attacks on civilian objects are unacceptable. There can be no impunity for this atrocity. The perpetrators must be held accountable. The Council could not once again have double standards as it has with the Palestinian genocide. President, bearing in mind the real causes of the ongoing conflict which affecting international peace and security, we consider that dialogue and respect for international law must prevail, not just because it's a legal obligation to ensure peace, but it's also the only legitimate way of honouring the memory of the children murdered in Minab school. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of New Zealand.
Mr. President, The strike on the Shajaria Tayyeba Girls' School in Minab, Iran, in this conflict is an absolute tragedy. We welcome the US decision that it will independently investigate what happened and release the results. This is an essential step forward toward accountability. The protection of children in peacetime and in conflict must remain a top priority for the international community. Children should not and must not be made to bear the cost of this conflict. New Zealand is deeply alarmed by the devastating impacts of this conflict on civilians. We call on all parties to the conflict to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law, including to protect civilians and civilian objects, including schools. We implore all states to take urgent action to protect children, uphold international law, and prevent further loss of life. Human rights must be upheld and protected at all times. We urge the parties to engage in negotiations to reach an immediate cessation of hostilities and a diplomatic solution to the conflict. The longer this conflict goes on, the more severe the human impacts for all. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Mr. President, Malaysia is deeply concerned about the escalation of hostilities and rising casualties in the Middle East. We unequivocally condemn the devastating airstrike on an elementary girls' school in Minab, which occurred on day one of this regional conflict. This callous attack on a civilian infrastructure claiming 168 lives, mostly young children, constitutes a gross violation of international law. Every child's life lost must shock our conscience. We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to their deaths. The destruction of educational spaces in situations of armed conflict deprives children of safety, learning, and hope. Mr. President, Malaysia emphasizes that all violations must be subject to prompt, independent, and credible investigations to ensure accountability. Malaysia calls on all parties to fully comply with their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights laws, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Malaysia reiterates the urgent need for immediate de-escalation, cessation of hostilities, and a return to dialogue. Any sustainable resolution must be grounded in the rule of law and address the root causes of the conflict. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Finland.
Mr. President, Finland aligns with the EU statement. We are deeply alarmed by the loss of civilian life and tremendous suffering of civilians, including children, caused by the hostilities in the whole region. Attacks on schools, hospitals, and other civilian infrastructure are completely unacceptable. Governments are required to take all measures to ensure that children's rights are fully respected also in armed conflicts. The Safe Schools Declaration provides useful tools as regards protecting the right to education during conflict. Finland calls for de-escalation and maximum restraint, the protection of civilians and civilian objects, including civilian infrastructure, and full respect of international law by all parties, including the UN Charter, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. Finland also calls for the respect of the universal human rights and fundamental freedoms of the Iranian people, including the right to choose their own future. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Philippines.
Mr. President, the Philippines expresses its sincere condolences to the families of the victims over the heartbreaking tragedy in Minab. The attacks that claimed the lives of 168 young school children are an assault on our shared humanity. Attacks against children in schools are grave breaches of international humanitarian law and result in serious violations of human rights. For the Philippines, children are zones of peace. As a member of the Global Pathfinding Alliance, the Philippines is firmly committed to advancing children's rights, including in situations of armed conflict. The Philippines will host the second Global Ministerial Conference on Ending Violence Against Children in November this year, with the aim of accelerating global action and enhancing accountability to protect children everywhere from all forms of violence in times of peace and in times of conflict. We call on all states, particularly parties to armed conflict, to fulfill their obligations to safeguard the rights, dignity, and safety of children at all times. Avoidable tragedies involving children must never be repeated nor normalized. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada.
Mr. President, we are shocked and profoundly distressed by the tragic deaths of 168 school children in Minab, Iran. Violence affecting children's schools or other civilian objects violates international humanitarian law and constitutes a grave violation against children in armed conflict, causing devastating impacts on their lives and well-being. Iranians are bearing an immense human cost in this war. Families are losing loved ones, and many face daily threats of attacks, raising living costs, and critical shortages of basic goods such as food, water, and energy. We implore all parties to comply with international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution in order to protect civilians and civilian objects. Canada supports an independent, impartial, and transparent investigation into the incident in Minab, accountability and redress for the victims, and the endorsement and implementation of the Safe Schools Declaration. As the toll on civilians rises, we urge all parties to de-escalate tensions, prioritize pathways for diplomacy, and ensure the protection of civilians. We mourn with the families affected by this unacceptable loss of life. All children have the right to education and must live and learn free from violence, including strikes. We extend our sincere sympathies to the families and loved ones of these school children. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Israel's military attack on the Islamic Republic of Iran, launched under the U.S. active support and patronage, and the military action of the U.S., which joined in it, are an illegal act of aggression and the most despicable form of violation of sovereignty in their nature from A to Z. The DPRK delegation condemns in the strongest tone the shameless rogue act of the U.S. and Israel, which put their domestic law before the recognized international law, and do not hesitate to abuse military muscle in order to realize their selfish and hegemonic ambition. The tyranny's high-handed and arbitrary practices make those countries directly related to the regional situation pay due price, and give rise to the concern that they may have a negative effect which cannot be disregarded politically, economically, and geopolitically on the region, which has no connection with the present Iranian situation. The unjustifiable war of aggression by the U.S. and Israel can never be tolerated in any case. The relevant and interested parties in the region would be well advised to fulfill their due responsibilities in switching the trend in the situation of the Middle East back to peace and stability. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. We align ourselves with the EU statement. Germany deeply deplores the loss of life of innocent civilians. Our delegation's thoughts are with the victims and their families. We reiterate our call for de-escalation and maximum restraint, the protection of all civilians and civilian infrastructure, including children, as also reflected in the Safe Schools Declaration in this armed conflict, and for the full respect of international law and international humanitarian law. Germany urges Iran to finally provide full and unhindered access to the mandates created by this Council to ensure that any allegations of violations of international humanitarian law can be independently investigated. In closing, let me reiterate our call for an end of the appalling violence and repression by Iran against its own people. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are deeply concerned with the escalation of hostilities in our region. An immediate ceasefire is needed to avoid further devastation. We will continue to make every effort to secure a ceasefire and restore stability in the region. Turkey condemns any action that violates international law, endangers the lives of innocent people, and targets civilian infrastructure. Schools, hospitals, places of worship, and water sources should not be targeted. The attack on the school in Minab is a violation of international humanitarian law and should not be repeated. Civilians must be protected at all times and under all circumstances. The fact that those killed were children makes the situation even more grave. We have to do everything in our power to prevent such killings. In line with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we consider it essential to safeguard the rights to life, survival and development of every child and call on all parties to take all necessary measures to ensure this. As we mentioned before under this roof, the region needs a comprehensive formula for peace that will replace long decades of instability. Turkey will continue to spare no efforts to end hostilities and build a lasting peace in our region. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, Sri Lanka remains deeply concerned with the evolving situation in West Asia and its implications for regional stability and global security. We are deeply saddened by the strike on Shajare Tayyab Girls' School in Minab, resulting in the tragic loss of life of 168 school children and injury to many. This tragedy brings to light the devastating consequences of the conflict, which must be avoided at all costs. Mr. President, Sri Lanka reiterates that respect for international law, including the principles of the UN Charter, remain critical in addressing the ongoing situation in the region. We urge all parties involved to ensure strict adherence to the relevant conventions and declarations and to prioritize the protection of civilian life, in particular of children, women, the elderly and persons with disabilities, as well as of critical infrastructure including schools, hospitals and medical and energy facilities. We call upon all parties to exercise maximum restraint and take all necessary measures for the immediate de-escalation of the situation. We emphasize the importance of diplomacy and dialogue to bring about lasting peace, stability and security in the region. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. Greece aligns with the EU statement. Greece is closely following the situation in Iran and the broader region with serious concern. We regret the continued loss of civilian lives, particularly children, and stress that the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure must remain a priority. Compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, is essential. Greece is deeply concerned about the tragic attack on a school in Minab on 28 February, which resulted in the loss of children's lives. Our thoughts and deepest condolences are with the families. Children are entitled to special protection at all times, including during armed conflict. Schools and other facilities dedicated to civilian use must be safeguarded, and all parties should take concrete steps to avoid harm to children and ensure their rights are fully respected. Incidents affecting educational institutions are particularly concerning. We call on all parties to exercise restraint and avoid further escalation, which would undermine regional stability and international security. Only dialogue, diplomacy and engagement can help reduce tensions and create the conditions for a lasting negotiated solution. We support diplomatic efforts aimed at de-escalation and the protection of human rights in the region. We reiterate our call for the respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms of the Iranian people and recognize the valuable role of international monitoring mechanisms addressing the human rights situation in Iran and support their continued work, which contributes to accountability and transparency. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Portugal.
Mr. President, Portugal aligns with the statement delivered by the European Union. We call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and to swiftly return to political and diplomatic solutions. We express our condolences to the victims and mourn the loss of life and the suffering caused to all affected. International law, including international human rights law and international humanitarian law, must be respected. The principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution are non-derogable. obligations. Civilians, and especially children, must never be the target of military attacks. Schools must remain safe environments where children can learn and develop free from fear or violence. Portugal stands ready to support all efforts towards ending hostilities and reaching a lasting peace. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria.
Mr. President, Austria aligns itself with the EU statement and recalls its national statement made at the urgent debate called by GCC and Jordan. We reiterate that diplomacy remains the only viable path forward and urge all parties to pursue de-escalation without delay. In line with the Convention of the Rights of the Child, the Safe Schools Declaration, the Children and Armed Conflict Framework, as well as the Political Declaration on Explosive Weapons in Populated Areas, Austria calls on all parties to 1. Strictly adhere to the principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution under international humanitarian law. 2. Ensure that schools, hospitals and other civilian facilities are never targeted or used for military purposes. 3. Conduct independent, transparent and impartial investigations into attacks on civilian infrastructure. And 4. Restrict or refrain from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, taking all feasible precautions to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, including the essential services for children to survive and avoid civilian harm. Austria will continue to devote particular attention to the protection of civilians, particularly children, affected by armed conflict and in post-conflict situations. Finally, we reiterate our support for the work of the fact-finding mission and the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Iran. I thank you.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished participants, that was the last speaker on the list, and we shall now turn to the list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations, and I give the floor to the representative of MAT for Peace, Development and Human Rights Association for a video intervention.
Thank you, Mr. President. MAT thanks the Council for holding the second urgent debate during the 61st session. We reiterate our condemnation of the air bombardment and targeting of educational institutions in Iran and in the GCC countries. This war and the U.S. military operations, especially near the island of Kharj, makes the situation renders the situation explodable and also makes children pay the price of mistakes they didn't commit. MAT has concerns that this war initiated by the United States of America and that has led to the killing of hundreds of children in Iran and Lebanon would create generations of children who do not trust international institutions or organizations, generations that only recognize the principle of retaliation. We call on bringing pressure to bear on the United States and the Israeli occupation, as well as Iran, to end these military operations and to stop any attack against schools, civilian objects, and to participate in good faith in negotiations for a ceasefire to achieve peace and peaceful coexistence amongst all in the Middle East. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of the Association Maona for Human Rights and Immigration.
Thank you. Over the last year, attacks on schools in conflict zones around the world have increased by 44%, affecting millions of children. Students and teachers as civilians and schools as civilian objects are protected under international humanitarian law. Attacking them is a war crime and a grave violation against children. We strongly condemn any attacks on schools. We also want to highlight that over the past few decades, Iran, through its militias, has been responsible for attacks on schools in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. In Syria, more than 7,000 1,000 schools were destroyed. In Iraq, even back in 1987, an Iranian missile hit Ebilat al-Shuhada school during the morning assembly, killing and injuring more than 200 students. After 2003, Iran was responsible for the assassination campaign of more than 500 Iraqi academies. In Yemen, the Iranian-backed Houthis, since their emergence in 2011, have targeted and destroyed the whole education system. They turned schools and universities into military training facilities, interrupting studies to recruit future fighters among students. It resulted in thousands of child soldiers and millions of children out of school. School bombardments stripped away their right to education and hope for a better future. Therefore, Association Maona and Geneva International Center for Justice call for accountability for all perpetrators of school attacks. No one is above the law. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Iran Human Rights Documentation Center.
Mr. President, the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center addresses this council with profound concern over the attacks at the Shajare-e-Tayyibeh Girls' School in Minab, an incident that violates the fundamental protection owed to children and educational institutions under international law. We stress the importance of the independent inquiries conducted by the fact-finding mission on Iran and the Special Rapporteur, which must be fully resourced, granted unfettered access to the country, and provided full cooperation by all parties. International law is clear. All children must have their rights protected and upheld at all times, in times of conflict, in times of civil unrest, and in times of peace. We urge this body to remember the 236 children reportedly killed by the Iranian government just this January, as protests were violently repressed. Recall that in the Woman Life Freedom Movement of 2022, girls' schools across Iran were subjected to raids by security forces. Today, Iranian civilians, including school children and minors, face dual risks, both large-scale external military operations and deliberate repression by their own authorities, heightening the risk of perpetration of atrocity crimes. The Iranian government continues to restrict the country's internet access, preventing civilians from receiving warnings or taking measures for physical protection from strikes. This access must be restored immediately. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Human Rights Watch.
Mr. President, Human Rights Watch is alarmed by attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure across the conflict, including schools and hospitals, and other harms to children, including as a result of mass displacement. The devastating, unlawful attack on a primary school in Minab that reportedly killed scores of civilians, including many children, should be investigated as a war crime by the US. All parties have an obligation to take all feasible precautions to avoid civilian harm. In addition to potential war crimes in the wider conflict, Iranian authorities continue to commit grave crimes against their own people, including children. The Special Rapporteur reported how protesters, including children, have been shot at close range or severely beaten by security forces amid the crackdown since January. The FFM has warned repression is likely to worsen amid the conflict. Those responsible for countrywide massacres in January have made credible threats to repeat them. The commander of police has threatened that security forces are ready to shoot and that people taking to the streets will be treated as the enemy, while the IRGC has warned of a harsher blow than January. Unlawful restrictions on communications and internet shutdown continue, putting all civilians at further risk amid the conflict. Mr. President, we are concerned by the fragmented and selective approach of this Council to the conflict. Every child in Iran, in Lebanon and beyond has the right to live free from fear, their rights and lives protected. There can be no room for double standards on international law. We again urge states to ensure a comprehensive, impartial approach to all violations by all parties, recognizing the rights of all victims without discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the United Nations Watch.
Mr. President, what happened at the Minab Girls' School, located next to an IRGC military base, is a tragedy. We welcome the U.S. decision to open an investigation by an officer independent of CENTCOM. Responsible democracies must hold themselves to account. But let us be clear. If anything, this incident was an exception that proves the rule. The United States has now conducted 10,000 strikes targeting IRGC weapons and military assets, not civilians. That's how they destroyed vast amounts of IRGC missile, drone, and naval capabilities. By contrast, from Dubai to Tel Aviv, the Islamic Republic of Iran is deliberately targeting Homes, playgrounds, hospitals, not by accident, but by design. In Israel, the casualty rate from Iranian attacks is 100% civilian. Distinguished delegates, there is a clear difference between inadvertently killing civilians during war, a tragedy that occurs in every conflict, and targeting civilians as a policy. Those who blur this moral distinction betray the very meaning of humanitarian law, because those who target civilians have a name: terrorists. That is why the EU officially designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guards by that name: terrorists. To the IRGC, we say, you do not represent the Iranian people. No, they consider you occupiers of their country. History's verdict is already written for those who murder thousands of their own people and who target hospitals and playgrounds and call it resistance. The IRGC has chosen the path of shame. I urge the civilized world, choose the path of honor. Stand with the Iranian people.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of ARC for video intervention.
Monsieur le Président.
President, the fact that a state calls for protection of children in armed conflict while being itself involved in grave violations against them is a cause for profound concern. 7th and 8th January, more than 200 children under the age of 18 were killed by security forces during protests. Several were detained in prison. The pupils killed in Minab, as well as all child victims of conflict, are neither responsible for political decisions or for the actors in hostilities. They are the primary victims of situations outside their control. For a number of years, certain policies have exposed the Iranian population to heightened risk. Grave violations have been documented, particularly lethal use of force against peaceful protesters. Overlapping information indicates also the presence of military facilities close to civilian areas, including close to schools and residential neighbourhoods. Such practices are a grave violation of IHL. We, the ARC Association and Zagros Centre for Human Rights, we call for an independent, impartial international investigation to be carried out to document the facts. Protection of children requires truth, justice and an end to impunity. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of IPWR.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Mr. President, the Institute for Protection of Women's Rights, while thanking Council for convening this urgent meeting, draws the Council's attention to one of the most unprecedented war crimes in recent history. Despite establishing humanitarian and human rights protections for children in armed conflicts, the occupying powers of Israel and the United States, disregarding all international laws, targeted Iranian students with more than 200 children killed to date. In the early hours of these attacks, the Shajareh Tayyib Elementary School in Minab was brutally struck, killing 165 innocent children in their classrooms. Targeting children in what should be the safest environment for their growth and education demonstrates the perpetrator's absolute disregard for human dignity and international law. Schools as civilian objects enjoy special protection under international humanitarian law, and attacks against them may constitute war crimes. As a member of Iran's civil society, we strongly condemn the deliberate bombing of the school, and we stress that children, teachers, and schools must never be military targets. We believe that all capacities and human rights mandates must be used to take immediate action for the criminal prosecution of the perpetrators of these atrocities. The silence and inaction of international human rights mechanisms and the resulting impunity will only reinforce this cycle and undermine the credibility of United Nations human rights institutions. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of the Organization for Defending Victims of Violence for a video intervention.
Mr. President, we are witnessing a total collapse of global morality. The aerial bombardment of Shajareh Tayyib Girls' School in Minab is not merely a breach of international humanitarian law. It is a testament to the horrifying impunity championed by the Israel and shielded by the United States. How can we expect Washington officials who are tied to their own scandals of sexual abuse to care about children in Iran? From the dark corners of their scandals to the open slaughter of girls aged 7 to 12 in their classrooms, they have no moral grounds left to stand on. We must ask, where are the lives we were supposed to protect? These are not just numbers, they are Fatemeh, Zahra, Maryam, Athare, and Hannane, and many other names. The girls of Minab were Iran's tomorrow. Today, their desks are empty, and their lessons remain unfinished. As these innocent souls ascend, the international community must find its voice. We cannot let double standard bury the future of a nation. We urge a meaningful investigation. The blood of the girls in Minab requires more than words. It requires enforcement of international law against both the perpetrators and those who provide the military means for such atrocities. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of the International Commission of Jurists.
The ICJ condemns the unlawful attack on the primary school in Minab. Direct attacks against civilians objects are strictly prohibited, as is the failure to take precautions to protect civilians and civilian objects. The strike must be investigated as a potential war crime. This attack is a part of a pattern of unlawful attacks against civilian objects by the parties to the conflict. The ICJ reiterates its call on all parties to the ongoing conflict to adhere to international law, including the principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality. The ICJ also reiterates its call on this Council to condemn and address all violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law committed by all parties to this conflict. Maintaining the integrity and credibility of this Council requires no less. As stressed by the chair of the FFN on Iran, Iranian people are caught between a large-scale military campaign by two countries, the US and Israel, and ongoing repression by their own government in Iran. In this context, it is of utmost importance that all relevant HRC mechanisms, including the FFM and the Special Rapporteur on Iran, are able to pursue their critical work to document human rights violations and abuses committed in Iran, especially those amounting to crimes under international law, with a view to contribute to accountability for such crimes, and states must cooperate fully with these mechanisms. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Association of Iranian Short-Statured Adults for a video intervention.
Mr. President, we cannot allow the mass killing of children to be normalized, nor buried beneath reports, statements, and expressions of grave concerns. What is required today is action and accountability. In Minab, 168 children were killed in a war crime carried out by U.S.-Israeli forces. The targeting of these children was part of a broader pattern of systematically abandoning legal obligations by the United States, continuing on its impunity to do so. One cannot expect humanitarian concerns for Iranian children from those whose pasts are shadowed by allegations of child exploitations, and such systematic cruelty is the hallmark of a war criminal. Any credible investigation must be independent and must center evidence and testimony from within Iran, by Iranians, and for the victims. Families have the right not only to the truth, but to dignity, to be heard and to be believed. What we're witnessing is not an isolated war crime. From Minab to Gaza, there is a pattern: the normalization of attacks on schools, the erosion of civilian protection, and the dehumanization of children. The post-Second World War legal order is collapsing before our eyes. The children of Shajareh Tayyibeh were the future of a nation. If this continues with impunity, then no child anywhere will ever be safe.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Maloka International.
La protección de la infancia y las instituciones.
Protection of children and education institutions in context of armed conflict is not a political option. It's an option of IHL, it's an obligation of IHL and of human rights. Attacks against the Minab school is a grave violation of those fundamental principles. The Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols are clear. Civilian objects, especially schools, enjoyed special protection. Attacking them is not just a violation of the principle of distinction, but also undermine the very foundations of the international legal order. This Council cannot be limited to just only a context investigation, but rather this needs to address the fact that international law recognises the legitimate right to self-defence in line with the UN Charter, as well as the obligation of states to not allow their territories to be used for acts against third parties. We're troubled by the trend to apply international law selectively. When certain actors resort to force, they invoke narratives of security. When others respond, though, then they are immediately condemned. These double standards undermine the credibility of the multilateral system. Protection of children cannot be instrumentalized in geopolitical disputes. Consistency is needed, responsibility from all actors is needed, and equal respect for international law is required. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Iman Ali's Popular Student Relief Society for a video intervention.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the midst of war, the protection of children must remain a duty for all parties. Over 100 schoolboys and girls were killed in the attack on the Shajar Tayyib school, and at least 100 other children across the country. Independent verification remains impossible due to the shutdown of the internet and the denial of access to the SR and the FFM on Iran. In violation of the CRC, an official of the IRGC in Tehran publicly stated that the Basij had recruited children as young as 12 for operational roles, including checkpoint inspections across Tehran. Children may pose serious risks to civilians during checkpoint inspections. At the same time, given that such checkpoints have reportedly been targeted in Israeli and US attacks, they are exposed to lethal danger. All parties to the conflict must respect the basic rights and safety of children. Their deaths cannot be dismissed as mere collateral damage. The USA and Israel bear responsibility to provide full reparation for unlawful harm caused to civilians, particularly children, including compensation to victims' families. They are also responsible for compensating damage to civilian infrastructure. Such reparation should be directed to a legitimate government elected through a free and fair process by the people of Iran. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Medical Support Association for Underprivileged Iranian Patients for a video intervention.
Mr. President, we were still grieving the loss of people in the 12-day aggression when the US and Israel brutally attacked Iran, starting with an elementary school in Minab, killing 168 children in 2 intentional horrific attacks. Girls gathered downstairs, sheltering from the first attack, when a second missile ended their short life stories. Their last moments make it needless to ask the international community to unequivocally condemn the inhuman US and Israel attack on the school. Such an assault on an educational institution where children are entitled to safety, learning, and dignity constitutes a flagrant violation of international law and a vivid war crime. Under international humanitarian law, schools are protected, and parties to any armed conflict must uphold the principles of distinction, which US and Israel have no respect for. Intentional attack against children or educational facilities constitute a grave breach of international law. We urge the Council to establish an investigation mechanism to collect all documents relevant to this US-Israel atrocity and ensure accountability for the perpetrators. Unfortunately, human rights have become a matter of double standards in this upside-down world we are living in. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Eliska Relief Foundation. Not here. I give the floor to the representative of Human Rights Research League for a video intervention.
Thank you, Mr. President. Human Rights Research League is deeply concerned about the human toll of the ongoing armed conflict, and particularly the civilian casualties it causes. We emphasize that all sides need to observe international law, also and especially in situations of armed conflict, and international humanitarian law is clear on this. It strictly forbids direct attacks on civilians and requests all parties to abide by the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution to minimize civilian suffering. Where children are hit in an attack, One or several of these principles have clearly not been sufficiently observed. We are also gravely concerned about the lives of political prisoners in Iran. According to humanitarian law, civilian detainees are to be protected from violence to life and person at any time. No one should be imprisoned for his political beliefs to begin with. But political prisoners are also in double jeopardy. They are considered enemies of the state and were subjected to torture and deprivation even before the war started. And during the recent bombings of Iran, reports indicate that prison guards had left their posts, bringing themselves to safety while leaving the prisoners locked in and without shelter. Human Rights Research League implores this council to ensure all sides observe humanitarian law and pressure the government of Iran to release all political prisoners and ensure their safety. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Amnesty International.
Indicates that the school in Minab was directly struck by U.S. forces with guided weapons, pointing to a failure to take feasible precautions to avoid civilian harm. U.S. authorities must ensure impartial, independent, and transparent investigations. Where sufficient evidence exists, competent authorities should prosecute any person suspected of criminal responsibility. In the aftermath of the attack, Iranian authorities have exploited the suffering of victims' families and survivors for propaganda purposes. Iranian forces have also carried out unlawful attacks against Israel and Gulf countries that have caused civilian harm, and Israel has carried out unlawful attacks in Iran and in Lebanon. We reiterate our urgent call for all parties in authorities threaten further mass killings of dissidents and protesters amid an ongoing internet shutdown they imposed. Prisoners and individuals detained in security facilities, including the thousands of arbitrarily detained protesters and other dissidents, are endangered both by strikes by the United States and Israel and also by the Iranian authorities, who continue to forcibly disappear, torture, and arbitrarily execute prisoners as bombs fall. This Council must insist that respect for international law and tackling impunity be the centerpiece of any genuine political resolution, with holistic accountability efforts driven by the gravity of the harms done rather than politics. This Council must champion a comprehensive and sustained strategy leveraging all tools and mandates available, including the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, treaty bodies, and the Human Rights Council mandates and processes. Thank you.
Thank you. I noted the technical glitch, and I request the Secretariat to ensure that it does not recur. And I now give the floor to the representative of Civic's World Alliance for Citizen Participation.
Mr. President, Civicus is gravely concerned about the unfolding situation in Iran and the Gulf region. The conflict is exacerbating the already closed civic space in Iran. We firmly condemn the indiscriminate attacks and targeting civilians, including children. The aerial attacks on school and civilian infrastructure constitute a grave breach of international humanitarian and human rights law. We urge a full and transparent investigation into all such instances to ensure justice for all victims. Following the US and Israel's aggression in breach of international law towards Iran and amid Iran's retaliation, the conflict has caused immense loss of life in addition to threatening further deterioration of fundamental freedoms in the region. The coordinated airstrikes by Israel and the US have killed at least 1,255 people in Iran, injuring about 10,000 according to official data. Serious concerns remain over the safety of protest detainees, forcibly disappeared protesters and imprisoned activists in Iran. Following the recent mass protests, many protesters are now facing the death sentence. We urge this Council to take measures to protect and ensure the safety of detained activists, journalists and protesters caught inside active conflict zone and to address human rights implications of the attacks objectively, impartially and without double standards. We urge all parties to respect the Iranian people's fundamental civic freedoms, hold hostilities and protect civilians, especially vulnerable groups, while the international community works toward a sustainable peace process. We thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of International Association of Justice Watch by video.
In the name of God, Madam President and distinguished members of the Human Rights Council, the Justice Watch Association in this urgent session today asks a very simple but decisive question. If an attack on a school does not provoke an immediate response from this council, then what will? The attack on a school in Minab carried out during the military operations of the United States and Israel is not merely a tragic incident. It is a test of the credibility of the international system for the protection of civilians. A school is a place for learning, not a battlefield. A child is entitled to protection, not to be a target. And if these basic principles collapse, what is at stake is not just a city or a country, but the very integrity of the international law. We warn that leaving an attack on a school unanswered sends a dangerous message to the world that even children are no longer protected. So we hereby call upon the Human Rights Council to unequivocally and formally condemn this attack, immediately establish an independent fact-finding mechanism in cooperation with Iranian NGOs holding consultative status as eyewitnesses, and hold those who ordered, carried out, and supported this attack accountable, leveraging the capacity of organizations with consultative status. Minab must become the point at which the world moves beyond silence. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Rajasthan, Samgras Kalyan Santan, for a video intervention.
Thank you, Mr. President. Armed conflict does not end when guns fall silent, especially for children. In 2024, a staggering 520 million children, 1 in 5 globally, have been in active conflict zones. These children are not merely survivors. They are right holders entitled to justice, healing, and a future. Recovery is not optional. It is an obligation under international law. Yet, fewer than 30% of child survivors in conflict receive adequate psychological or social integration support. Evidence shows that community-based psychological care, access to education, family reunification, and livelihood support significantly reduce re-recruitment and intergenerational violence. We must move beyond rhetoric to systematic action. We urge all states to invest in gender and age-sensitive integration programs, ensuring every child formerly associated with armed groups is recognized first as a victim. Establish accessible, child-friendly justice mechanisms that prioritize restorative practices over retribution. Guarantee meaningful child participation in designing and monitoring recovery processes because policies about children must include children. Mr. President, accountability is prevention. Without reparations, recovery remains incomplete. Let us transform today's discussions into tomorrow's protections. Every child deserves a childhood, not a conflict zone. We thank you. May all live happily.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Center for Global Non-Killing.
Dear human beings, Mr. President, dear living populations of the earth, dear 40s, including the teachers, excellencies, everyone, everywhere, in the name of the right to learn. What should we? What do we learn in school? What should we learn? What should we do at the Human Rights Council? The universal value of life, the right to happiness, the duty to avoid violence, the commitment to solve disputes peacefully, to learn from our mistakes, to repair them, to learn what it takes to bring humanity into a brighter and safer stage of life. The human condition has marvelously improved in the past decades because of human rights, of the respect for the human person. The path ahead is steep, urgent. Humanity requires lessons of life. These should not be hard or violent lessons. The worth giving to the individual needs to serve human history. Attacking a school or killing anyone, persons that could have lived 100 years or more, persons that could bring an essential contribution to the future and the well-being of mankind. Killing is to a large extent self-destructive. Full respect for human life is the path ahead. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. This was the last speaker we could accommodate at this meeting. And this brings us to the end of this urgent debate. Excellencies, distinguished participants, we will now take a short technical break and then proceed with the presentation of reports and the general debate under the agenda item 10. Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished participants, we will now begin by hearing the presentation of the report of the Board of Trustees of the United Nations Voluntary Fund for Technical Cooperation in the Field of Human Rights. I have the pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Nozifo January Bardil, Chairperson of the Board of Trustees. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning, members. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of the Deputy High Commissioner and acknowledge the fact that this will probably be the last of her attendance of the Human Rights Council. And we'd like to thank her on behalf of the board for the support that she's granted us over the years we've worked with UNADA. Distinguished representatives of members and observer states, colleagues and friends, it is absolutely my honor to chair, as chair of the Board of Trustees of the Voluntary Fund for Technical Cooperation in the field of human rights, to present the board's annual report to the Council, covering its 60th and 61st session held in April and November, respectively. At the outset, I wish to thank the High Commissioner and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights colleagues, both at headquarters and in the field, for their continued cooperation and resilience during an exceptionally challenging period. The Board remains deeply committed to providing strategic guidance to strengthen the Office's technical cooperation work, especially in the face of today's acute global challenges. The past year has seen unprecedented pressure on international human rights and humanitarian law, a decline in multilateral trust, and increasing financial strain across the UN system. These dynamics directly affect OHCR's ability to respond to the growing demand for technical cooperation. As the report notes, states continue to request in-country presences, regional engagement, and human rights advisors at levels that far exceed available resources. In this context, the Board reiterates its core message: this is not the moment to step back from multilateral human rights cooperation. On the contrary, technical cooperation remains one of the most effective tools to support national reforms, strengthen institutions, prevent crisis, and advance the 2030 agenda. The mandate of the Voluntary Fund to help states build institutional frameworks and capacities that give effect to international human rights standards is therefore more vital than ever. Excellencies, allow me to highlight three key findings from our sessions. First, the Board examined the Office's technical cooperation work within the rapidly evolving global environment marked by declining unearmarked resources, shifts in donor funding policies, and heightened operational demands. The Board welcomed the Office's ongoing regionalization strategy under the Office's 2.0 and its alignment with the Secretary General's UN80 initiative, both aimed at strengthening cross-pillar collaboration and making support more accessible to states at the regional level. Secondly, the Board held in-depth discussions with the Office's presences working on the four thematic areas most affected by global crisis. First thematic area was on accountability for war crimes and gross human rights violations, including case studies from Ukraine, from Sudan, and especially the occupied Palestinian territory, where the Office applies a three-pillar approach combining monitoring, protection, coordination, and legal analysis to support rights-based humanitarian response and early warning. Secondly, responsible social media and digital technologies with increasing risks from surveillance, disinformation, and harmful online content. The Board welcomed the Office's expanded digital monitoring tools, capacity building for journalists, and advocacy with other international institutions. Thirdly, diversity, equality, and inclusion, with examples from Moldova on disability inclusion, minority rights data collection, and rights-based communication and anti-discrimination mechanisms. Fourthly, the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, with examples from Southern Africa illustrating how human rights standards guide climate policy, environmental protection, and safeguards for environmental human rights defenders. The board was impressed by how the office's field presences accomplish with limited means, offering impactful, scalable models of cooperation. Furthermore, the board reviewed implementation of its recommendations since 2021, including progress on the Human Rights Advisor Program, now funded in part through the Voluntary Fund after closure of the Human Rights Mainstreaming Fund. Technical cooperation in CERTS, particularly in the Pacific, where the office helped integrate human rights in the Pacific Climate Mobility Framework and strengthened follow-up by two UPR recommendations, including the deployment of a UPR advisor to Central Asia and the launch of the new UPR Knowledge Hub to support peer learning. Dear Excellencies, the board also emphasized the central role of the Universal Periodic Review as an entry point for UN engagement at country and regional levels, noting that the UPR recommendations provide a shared framework for action across governments, UN country teams, national human rights institutions, and civil society. Human rights advisors reported that the UPR is one of the most effective tools for integrating human rights into UN planning, helping align programs with agreed national priorities. The board welcomed the office's efforts to improve UPR follow-up through clustering of recommendations, regional UPR support, and the new UPR Knowledge Hub, which together help states translate commitments into concrete reforms and guide targeted technical cooperation. Excellencies, in 2025, the Voluntary Fund supported technical cooperation programs in 55 countries and territories. Total income reached $27.4 million, allowing the office to maintain assistance despite reduced unearmarked contributions. Expenditure amounted to $28.9 million, with a year-end reserve of $24.2 million, enabling continuity into 2026. The board remains deeply concerned, however, that earmarked contributions continue to rise, reducing the office's flexibility to respond to emerging needs. Predictable, multi-year, unearmarked funding is essential for a program whose value lies in its agility and its responsiveness. The board expresses its sincere appreciation to states that maintained or increased contributions, including new multi-year commitments. Drawing from its analysis this year, the board would like to emphasize the following points. That we reaffirm political and financial support for multilateral human rights cooperation at a time of systematic pushback. Protect the space for technical cooperation in the fourth thematic area we reviewed, all of which are severely affected by the global crisis. Strengthen the Human Rights Advisor Program, which remains among the most effective tools for supporting states at country level. Increase unearmarked multi-year funding to preserve the agility and responsiveness of the office's technical cooperation. Improve communication of results, including better visibility of impact and proactive public diplomacy from field officers. And lastly, maintain one in-person board session per year, especially country visits, which remains essential for the board to fulfill its mandate. Finally, Excellencies, the board has seen firsthand how transformative technical cooperation can be, from strengthening national protection systems to improving laws, institutions and policies, to supporting accountability, climate-resilient development and the rights of people in vulnerable situations. The modest investments made through the Voluntary Fund translate into significant lasting impacts on the ground. We thank all contributors to the Voluntary Fund and the UPR Voluntary Fund, and we encourage more states to join them. In these testing times, sustained technical cooperation is absolutely essential for stability, for prevention, and for the realization of human rights for all. I thank you.
Thank you. I'm now pleased to give the floor to Ms. Nada Al-Nashif, Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, to deliver the annual presentation on behalf of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on technical assistance and capacity building, and to provide the oral update on behalf of the High Commissioner on cooperation with Georgia. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, distinguished Chair of the Board of Trustees of the VFTC, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted and very proud to deliver this statement on a theme very close to my heart as my last interaction with the Human Rights Council. Human rights technical cooperation is at the center of how we turn human rights commitments and legal obligations into meaningful improvements in people's lives. It is anchored in national ownership, grounded in the recommendations of the UN human rights mechanisms, and built through partnerships with governments, national human rights institutions, civil society, and the UN system. Our collective efforts over the past year demonstrate the profound impact these partnerships can achieve, and I'd like to share some positive examples from across the world. First of all, technical cooperation continues to enable national implementation of recommendations from the UN human rights mechanisms, including UPR, treaty bodies, and special procedures. I'll give a few examples. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, OHCHR supported authorities in designing a national recommendations tracking database, enabling systematic follow-up to accepted UPR recommendations. In Cambodia, the office worked with the National Follow-up Mechanism to disseminate all accepted UPR recommendations, convening ministries, parliament, and civil society to assign responsibilities and agreed timelines. And in Djibouti, we are conducting a legal and policy review of frameworks related to domestic work, supporting the government to align national legislation with international standards and advancing implementation of recommendations from the mechanisms. In Jordan, the office helped to integrate treaty body recommendations into national strategies and supported the country's first situational analysis on disability and climate change to align climate policy with human rights standards. Second, technical cooperation builds sustainable national institutions capable of protecting rights in the long term. In Papua New Guinea, the Cabinet's approval of the National Human Rights Strategy 24 to 29, developed with this office's support, marked the first formal commitment to establish a Paris Principles-compliant national human rights institution. In Kuwait, the Office and the Ministry of Interior conducted training of trainers programs on human rights and law enforcement, supporting the building of national capacity to incorporate human rights standards into policing and reinforcing preventive approaches within law enforcement institutions. In Syria, OHCHR provided capacity building and legal advice to the National Fact-Finding Committee that was examining coastal violence, strengthening its methodology, its analytical approach, and the use of international human rights standards. And in Panama, we provided technical assistance in support of legislative reform that enabled the Defensoría del Pueblo to regain its A status accreditation, reinforcing national accountability. Third, we know that technical cooperation helps safeguard civic space and inclusive participation. In Kyrgyzstan, the office offered analysis on restrictive legislation and supported the National Human Rights Institution to review its detention monitoring methodology with civil society experts. And in Moldova, we supported Roma mediation systems that expanded access to documentation and essential services for marginalized groups. Fourth, technical cooperation advances both equality and inclusion. In Guatemala, the office strengthened disability inclusion by supporting the Ministry of Health and the National Council for Persons with Disabilities to develop and implement regulations under the new biopsychosocial certification law. The office's cooperation with the Constitutional Court of Ecuador supported the development of a jurisprudence guide on indigenous justice, reinforcing equality and cultural rights. We also worked very much at the regional level, for example, contributing technical expertise to ASEAN's guidelines on the non-punishment principle for victims of trafficking, establishing a new normative standard. Fifth, technical cooperation strengthens prevention, early warning, and evidence-based protection. In the Pacific, we ensured that human rights were embedded in the regional framework on climate mobility to support people-centered responses to displacement. In Peru, the work with specialized prosecutors helped to integrate human rights standards into 19 emblematic protest-related investigations, strengthening early warning, transparency, and accountability. And in the Central African region, early warning snapshots and election period monitoring supported timely advocacy, while capacity building with ECAS reinforced a regional human rights-based early warning network. In Qatar, Working again at the regional level, we co-organized the Doha International Conference on Artificial Intelligence and Human Rights, bringing together over 1,200 stakeholders to advance a shared vision for human rights-based and inclusive AI governance. Mr. President, across all regions, we see best practices emerging. Robust national mechanisms for implementation, reporting, and follow-up, supported by digital tracking tools, improve coherence and accountability. Triangular cooperation, governments, national human rights institutions, and civil society, creates durable foundations for reform. And evidence-driven prevention, including human rights due diligence, screening, early warning networks, and climate mobility analytics, is increasingly central to our collective work. At the same time, of course, effective technical cooperation depends very much on our ability to rigorously monitor and assess human rights situations. That monitoring allows us to identify evolving risks, understanding the needs of right holders, measuring whether our assistance indeed does contribute to strengthening national protection system. Also to determine whether reforms really bring forward those meaningful improvements for rights holders. And so monitoring and technical cooperation must remain mutually reinforcing elements of our engagement. Your Excellencies, in conclusion, let me underscore how the current financial situation has significantly affected our ability to provide technical cooperation. As you have already heard from the Chair, declining unearmarked funding and regular budget-based liquidity constraints have forced us to scale back in-country presences and activities. We have made strategic adjustments, focusing our efforts on contexts where political space, where national demand, and where genuine willingness to engage create meaningful opportunities for impact. The sustained and predictable support from the Member States remains essential for this office to maintain both the scope and the quality of its work. And I wish to sincerely thank the Board of Trustees of the Voluntary Fund for their generous advice, their thoughtful contributions, and their steadfast commitment, as well as all the donors who support this work. Technical cooperation succeeds when it is sustained, inclusive, and grounded in the lived realities of the people it serves. And on that positive note, Mr. President, if you allow me and distinguished delegates, since this is my last appearance at this Human Rights Council as Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, I wish to take this opportunity to thank you all for the important collaboration, for the constructive engagement, and most of all, for the trust and confidence which I have enjoyed with your representatives and the delegations. It has been a distinct privilege to serve in this role and to have been able to contribute to the invaluable work of this office and indeed the entire human rights system. I commend your continuing efforts. There is no more noble endeavor in these turbulent times, and I remain hopeful, as we must, that our cause, that of human rights for everyone, everywhere, will endure. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Yes, my colleague Marit will do Georgia.
Oh, you're leaving now?
Yes.
So, Madam Deputy High Commissioner, allow me to say just some words. And colleagues here, many, perhaps all, would be with me in wishing you all the best and to thank you for your service as a Deputy High Commissioner in the past 6 years. Is it 6 years? In the past 6 years. We highly value the intellectual process that you have led, your quiet your quiet resolve in the promotion and the protection of human rights. So thank you very much, Madam. We wish you all the best in your next endeavors, and we wish you to stay safe. Thank you.
I thought that not.
Okay. I'm now pleased to give the floor to Ms. Marit Kohonen-Sheriff, Director on the Global Operation Division of the OHCHR, to deliver her report on cooperation with Georgia on behalf of the High Commissioner. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to update the Council on the implementation of Resolution 60/29 on cooperation with Georgia, adopted on 8 October 2025. We recognize the continued cooperation of the government of Georgia, including in hosting an OHCHR presence in Tbilisi. However, during this reporting period, we have noted a series of legislative, institutional, and political developments in Georgia that raise serious human rights concerns. The accelerated enactment of restrictive laws has progressively narrowed civic space and weakened democratic safeguards, including the freedom of association and peaceful assembly, as well as institutional checks and balances. Parliament adopted amendments to the law on grants, the law on assembly and manifestations, the Code of Administrative Offences, and the Criminal Code. These measures impose extensive reporting requirements and severe sanctions, placing disproportionate burdens on civil society organizations and creating inconsistencies with Georgia's international human rights obligations. Additional amendments negatively affecting freedom of expression and media freedom were adopted in 2025. Administrative penalties for speech deemed offensive towards public officials raised concerns due to vague wording and risk of arbitrary enforcement. Changes to defamation legislation weakens protections for journalistic sources and increase the risk of strategic lawsuits against public participation. Restrictions on foreign funding for broadcasters, coupled with harsher penalties for protest-related conduct, have further narrowed civic and democratic space. The office has also received credible reports that intimidation, threats, and the freezing of bank accounts have led civil society organizations to curtail their activities, contributing to a marked erosion of civic space. Most recently, on the 4th of March 2026, Parliament adopted further amendments expanding governmental control over foreign funding, criminalizing so-called external lobbying, restricting political activity, and introducing an extremism offense potentially applicable to actions perceived as questioning the legitimacy of the government. Before their adoption, the High Commissioner had conveyed to the Georgian authorities the office's readiness to assist in reviewing the draft amendments to support ensuring their compliance with Georgia's human rights obligations. The office also remains concerned about allegations of serious human rights violations in the context of public protests, including arbitrary arrests, ill treatment, unnecessary, disproportionate use of force against demonstrators, journalists, and media workers. We note the government's rejection of allegations regarding the use of prohibited chemical irritants during the November and December 2024 protests, and we urge prompt and independent, thorough investigations into all allegations of human rights violations, with full respect for due process and fair trial guarantees. Mr. President, the office regrets that the authorities in control in Abkhazia and South Ossetia have not responded to our requests for access, despite repeated calls by this Council. These authorities bear the responsibility to respect and ensure the human rights of all individuals in areas under their control. We need updated information on the human rights situation in Abkhazia and a baseline human rights assessment in South Ossetia. Allegations concerning the rights of ethnic Georgians in the Gali and Akalgori districts, including restrictions on freedom of movement, limited access to primary health care, and continued constraints on using Georgian as a language of instruction in schools in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, remain a matter of serious concern. We urge all responsible actors to remove undue movement restrictions by fully reopening all crossing points along the administrative boundary lines. Other persistent allegations of human rights violations affecting ethnic Georgians remain unaddressed. These include arbitrary detentions, impunity for alleged violations of the right to life and the prohibition of torture, restricted access to healthcare and essential services, as well as infringements on livelihoods, housing, land, and property rights. We call on all actors to implement confidence-building measures grounded in human rights, ensure an enabling civic space, and allow international organizations to operate in Abkhazia and South Ossetia without undue restrictions. We urge an end to arbitrary deprivation of liberty and the prompt resolution of outstanding issues related to identity and civil documentations to ensure freedom of movement and the equal enjoyment of all rights. Equitable access to economic, social, and cultural rights, including quality education in the Georgian language, must also be ensured. Mr. President, in conclusion, OHCHR reaffirms its commitment to providing technical assistance and supporting efforts to advance human rights protection, free civic space, and democratic governance throughout Georgia. I thank you.
Thank you. Excellencies, distinguished participants, we will take a short technical break and then continue the general debate under Agenda Item 10. And I hereby close the 49th meeting of the 61st session of the Human Rights Council, and the meeting will begin with the 50th meeting in a few minutes. Thank you.